I Hello guys, welcome to the Modern American series. I am continuing in our textbook these optional videos about the different sections as we progress through the content all the way to the Barack Obama era. This will be on my YouTube channel. So watch it there. Subscribe to this YouTube channel to keep watching. So we are going where we left off was the Cold War, Eisenhower's Cold War stance. Now we are going and the foreign policies attached to it. Now we are going to discuss the civil rights movement. And this, I also want to say this. It is very interesting to be studying this with you guys during this time period because of the stuff happening with George Floyd and all that happening. So the civil rights movement. While Eisenhower was concentrated on Cold War issues, events with revolutionary significance to race relations were developing in the United States. So this was a very much domestic issue. So home front issue. Did not quite spread worldwide. So origins of this movement. The baseball player Jackie Robinson had broken the color line in 1947 by being hired by the Brooklyn Dodgers as the first African American to play on a major league team since the 1880s. President Truman integrated the armed forces in 1948 and introduced civil rights legislation in Congress. These were the first well-publicized indications that race relations after World War II were changing. As the 1950s began, however, African Americans in the South were still by law segregated from whites in schools and in most public facilities. They were also kept from voting by poll taxes, literary tests, grandfather clauses, and intimidation. Social segregation left most of them poorly educated, while economic discriminations kept them in the state of poverty. So Truman was introducing legislation to Congress and disarming the armed forces and all of that, but still the issues were in the South, and issues for African Americans were largely from going away, they still suffered these segregation, poll taxes, literary tests, not being able to vote, the Ku Klux Klan, the list goes on and on. The origins of the modern civil rights movement can be traced back to the movement of millions of African Americans from the rural South to the urban centers of the South and North. In the North, African Americans who joined the Democrats during the New Deal had a growing influence in party politics in the 1990s. So, what do we see here? We see this change in demographics because the African Americans who are migrating to the north are largely having a growing influence on party politics in the Democratic Party during the New Deal. This is what's interesting, how we are starting to see a shift from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party and the Democratic Party to the Republican Party. Politics is flipping around. The Cold War also played an indistinct role in changing both government politics and social attitudes. The U.S. reputation for freedom and democracy was competing against communist ideology for the hearts and minds of the peoples in Africa and Asia. So, against this global background, racial segregation and discrimination stood out as glaring wrongs that needed to be corrected. President Truman took one step in this direction by desegregating the military in 1948. So, how can millions of African Americans be oppressed? While you are fighting a war to promote freedom. So Truman took a big action to please these protests, these quote unquote protests, by desegregating the military. Let's talk about Brown versus Board of Education, desegregating the schools, because that was a sort of a big case and a big monumental change that we celebrate and cherish today. The NAACP had been working through the courts for decades trying to overturn the Supreme Court's 1896 decision, Plessy versus Ferguson, which allowed segregation in separate but equal facilities. Okay. In the late 1940s, the NAACP won a series of cases involving higher education. That means college and stuff like that. Brown decision. One of the great landmark cases in Supreme Court history was argued in the early 1950s by a team of NAACP lawyers led by Thurgood Marshall. In Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, They argued that segregation of black children into public schools was unconstitutional because it violated the 14th Amendment guarantee of equal protection of the laws. In May 1954, the Supreme Court agreed with Marshall and overturned the Plessy case. Writing for a unanimous court, Chief Justice Earl Warren ruled that, so two keys. First, separate facilities are inherently unequal and unconstitutional. And two, second point, school segregation should end with all deliberate speed. So there was, of course, some resistance to this ruling. Opposition to the Browns' decision erupted throughout the South. To start with, 101 members of Congress signed the Southern Manifesto, condemning the Supreme Court for clear abuse of judicial powers. States fought the decision several ways, including the temporary closing of public schools and setting up private schools. The Ku Klux Klan made a comeback, and violence against blacks increased. In Arkansas, in 1956, Governor Orval Faubus used the state's National Guard to prevent nine African American students from entering Little Rock Central High School as ordered by the federal court. President Eisenhower then intervened. When the president did not actively support desegregation or the Brown decision, he understood his constitutional duty to uphold federal authority. Eisenhower ordered federal troops to stand ground in Little Rock and protect black students. Resistance remained stubborn. In 1964, 10 years after the Supreme Court decision, less than 2% of blacks in the South attended integrated schools. So, what does this all mean? The Brown versus Board of Education decision was good for the good, was inherently good and the right thing to do in terms of integrating the schools. But did it work? Did it work? That's the question. That's on the minds of educators, principals, superintendents, governors, state legislators. Did it work? Because we see this resistance to the movement even then. And so what we see today, did it work? Do we see a racially mixed school? So I want to leave that then, because the Little Rock 9 is important to know. So make sure that gets on your study sheets, because the Little Rock 9, did it only prove the resistance in the South to this decision, but it also we see federalism, state versus federal. We see the president not siding with the decision, but siding with federal authority. So we see lots of things in the case of the Little Rock Nine. Let's talk about the Montgomery bus boycotts. And this, if you don't know, had to do with Rosa. We are talking about the story of Rosa Parks. And I'm not gonna, the textbook will probably repeat it, but we all know that story by now. In 1955, a Montgomery, Alabama bus took on more white passengers. The driver ordered a middle-aged black woman to give up her seat to one of them. Rosa Parks refused, and her arrest for violating the segregation law sparked a massive African American protest in the form of a boycott of the city buses. The Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., minister of the Baptist Church where the boycott started, soon emerged as the inspirational leader of a nonviolent movement to end segregation. The protests touched off by Rosa Parks and the Montgomery boycott resulted in the Supreme Court ruling that segregation laws was unconstitutional. The boycott also sparked other civil rights protests that reshaped America over the coming decades. So the Montgomery boycott supported and ignited change in the laws. Signed into law by President Eisenhower, two civil rights laws of 1957 and 1960 were the first such laws to be enacted by the U.S. Congress since Reconstruction. They were modest in scope, providing for a permanent civil rights commission and giving the Justice Department new powers to protect the voting rights of blacks. Despite this legislation, Southern officials still used an arsenal of obstructive tactics to discourage African Americans from voting, such as all these voting discrimination acts. The nonviolent protest. What the government would not do, the African American community did for itself. In 1957, Martin Luther King Jr. formed the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, which organized ministers and churches in the South to get behind the civil rights struggle. In February 1960, college students in Greensboro, North Carolina, started the sit-in movement after being refused service at a segregated Woolworth lunch counter. To call attention to this injustice of segregated facilities, students would deliberately invite arrest by sitting in restricted areas. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was formed a few months later to keep the movement organized. In the 1960s, African Americans used the sit-in tactic to integrate restaurants, hotels, buildings, libraries, pools, and transportation throughout the South. The results of the boycotts, sit-ins, and court rulings and government responses to pressure marked a turning point in the civil rights movement. Progress was slow, however. In the 1960s, a growing impatience among many African Americans would be manifested in violent confrontations in the streets. So, we have nonviolent protest. What were these two? There was two main types. Boycotts. What was the other main type? Sit-ins. Boycotts and sit-ins were the two main types of nonviolent protest. Congress dropped bans on Chinese and other Asian immigrants and eliminated race as a barrier to naturalization, but the quota system remained in place until 1965. Puerto Ricans, as American citizens, could enter the United States without restrictions. However, Mexicans faced a choice of working under contract in the Braceros program, entering as a regulated legal immigrant, or crossing the borders as illegals. So this sparked the moment of illegals crossing. In the early 1950s, officials responding to complaints from native-born workers and from Mexico launched Operation Wetback, which forced an estimated 3.8 million people to return to Mexico. Mexican migrants remained in the United States, often faced discrimination and exploitation by commercial farmers. So that's a wrap in today's video covering the civil rights movement. In the next video, we are going to cover the popular culture in the 50s, so stay tuned.